I'm going to go very quickly today and talk about what role truth plays and to what extent the enduring principles of journalism apply at all anymore. We are in what has been called the post-fact age. What does that really mean? And is it true? What are the implications of a post-fact world, or a world in which facts are challenged, for democracy? In the next 30 minutes, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to talk about the decline in trust that we've had in the United States and elsewhere. I'm going to talk about the old elements of journalism, the principles of journalism that evolved in the 20th century. I'm going to talk about how they're challenged today, to what extent these principles still apply, and what the path forward is, and hopefully not leave you depressed. First of all, it's important to understand that trust in media has dropped by about half since the 1970s. In 1976, 72% of all Americans had a fair or a large amount of trust in media. That had fallen to 32% by 2016. What's not understood well is that half of that decline occurred between 1977 and 1997, before the internet. By the way, it's ticked up slightly since Donald Trump was president in the United States. What happened between 1977 and 1997? Well, the first thing is we had an advent in technology. We had the cable television came along, and the TV dial went from 4 channels to 40 or 400. We also had in the United States deregulation of media. The fairness doctrine was eliminated, the equal time rules, a variety of things that allowed for more partisan media. And third, you had a number of players, particularly in American talk radio, marketing themselves on the basis that the mainstream media were liberal and biased. The result of all this is we had more choices. And while we see decline in trust across all groups, it's most acute among American conservatives, Republicans. Today, only 14% of Republicans have a fair trust in media. What's particularly important to understand, however, is that an ominous sign in the data. The group that is least trusting of all of media today, after Republicans, are millennials, people under 40. Why is that? These are people who grew up in this fragmented media environment with a lot of partisan media and a lot of media marketing itself as opposed to a mainstream press that was considered biased. All of this happened before 2016. Then something else happened in the United States. Enter Donald Trump, exploiting existing doubts about media, a populist figure whose rise builds on the long-standing polarization in American politics and distrust in media. Let's deconstruct Trump's critique of the media. He talks about fake news, a term, by the way, we heard this morning from out of the mouth of a journalist. He says that the media are the enemy of the people, and he talks about the failing New York Times, failing media. What's the subtext behind that? Fake means that media are unreliable. Enemy means they're elitist. They're not like us. They're part of the other. And failing means they're on the wrong side of history, that eventually they'll go away and some new media that is Trumpian will survive. The goal of this rhetoric is not to make people believe in alternative media. It's to make them doubt the media that they see. It's to make them doubt real news and to make them believe in the leader. If you agree with me, you should believe me and disbelieve other. What's next, by the way? If we've got Trump and we've got this, think about this. If you have a child today who's 5 or 6 years old, the internet is something that exists in the sky, and they ask a question. What's the answer to this? And the internet answers. But instead of search, there's one answer. So who's going to supply that one answer? Which, by the way, Google and Amazon and Apple will choose. Where does that leave journalism? And where does that leave facts? It's an existential challenge. The first one is, how do we as journalists cover a leader who calls them the enemy? How do you cover them in a disinterested way, objectively? Existential challenge number 2, because one's not enough. How to report facts about someone who believes that facts are subordinate to belief. If you correct them, if you fact check them, they don't care. Existential challenge number 3. How do we believe anything? Science, advertising, or come to compromise if knowledge and facts are subordinate to pre-existing belief? Let's not forget existential challenge number 4. Before all this happened, our economic model had blown up. So this is what we call in speech making, problematizing the problem. So I've hopefully made this even more complex than you thought it was when I got here. Okay, on the eve of the internet, we were set out to identify what made journalism different than media. So remember, there was a crisis in trust that happened in the 1970s and went into the late 90s. So I was part of a group called the Committee of Concerned Journalists that tried to identify during that period, what is it that distinguishes journalism from an undifferentiated world of media? Because all of this explosion in technology and cable was creating new media that was not journalistic. We created the Committee of Concerned Journalists. We held 21 gatherings around the United States. We did surveys and studies, looked at history. The result was this book, The Elements of Journalism. We identified 10 principles that were to the core of journalism. And we identified the primary purpose of journalism, which was to provide citizens with knowledge so that they can be free and self-governing. I won't go into the long history of media and how it evolves, but the purpose of journalism in the end is to create information so that people can converse and self-govern. The 10 principles, there are 5 here. I'm not going to talk about all of them. Here's the next 5. To what extent do these still apply, or are they out of date? My answer is that people still have the same information needs as before. If we go back to this list, these are things that came out of people's needs, public needs. They didn't come out of a university setting or some philosopher's brain. But how journalists fulfill these principles has to change drastically because of technology. And those news organizations that fail to change the way they live up to these principles will not survive. I'll spend my time mostly on 2 of the 10 principles, truth and verification. Remember, these principles, as I said before, came from the street, not from philosophers. The news media was always a commercial business that had to supply information that people would trust. So these principles came out of what citizens needed. Here's the first principle. Journalism's first obligation is to the truth. In the Elements, we call this practical or functional truth. It's what societies operate. It's not philosophical truth like you discuss in an undergraduate class. It's how we decide whether someone's guilty, whether we're to pay our taxes. It's the kind of truth that we operate by day to day. This functional truth goes beyond mere accuracy. In 1947, something called the Hutchins Commission in the United States was put together to try and identify the responsibilities of the press. And they said back then, now 80, 70 years ago, it's not enough to tell the truth. It's not enough to tell the facts. You need to tell the truth about the facts. So this notion of context and truth being something more than accuracy is not some new idea that we've come up with recently. But this In journalism, the truth emerges over time. It doesn't necessarily come from the first story. This first story about the accident north in Maine and 2 people were killed and there were 3 cars involved, et cetera, the idea that the road at North and Maine needs to be fixed and the street light is out and why this accident happened, that may come out over time. So are we in a post-fact age in which people don't care about truth anymore? Do citizens still care that their news is accurate and reliable? Or does it not matter, as Donald Trump would suggest? My answer is not as simple as you might think. My answer is yes, truth and accuracy still matter. And journalists, by the way, we build truth fact by fact. We break a story, we find out the first account. We are very invested in facts. We're very literal about how we arrive at truth. But we have to recognize that how we do this has changed dramatically. We are no longer gatekeepers over what people know. Instead, today, journalists are often annotators of what people have already heard. Let me say that one more time. In the 20th century, media were the primary way that people got facts in the first place. And the metaphor we used was that the press were gatekeepers. Today, we are often annotators, correcting and contextualizing what people have already heard. The leader tweets, and we have to say whether the tweet is true. And not only that, why did the leader mislead in a tweet? Why did they exaggerate? What's the point of this? Why are they bringing this up at all? Contextualizing rather than gatekeeping has become a much larger part of our job. This dramatically alters the discipline of verification, which is one of the key concepts that we talk about. In the Elements of Journalism, we say that the essence of journalism is the discipline of verification, getting facts right and showing people how we did it. Since we're no longer the first source, we have to be radically transparent today about how we know what we know and why people should believe us. Transparency, why should anyone believe you? Show your work about sources, stories. I often say that the 20th century was the trust me era of journalism. Trust me, I know, I have access. Today we live in the show me era of journalism. Show me why I should believe you. And by the way, the me in those two phrases, trust me, the media. Show me, the citizen. By the way, this notion of transparency, showing your work, this was the original meaning of objectivity when that concept was transferred from social science into journalism at the beginning of the 20th century. The notion of journalistic objectivity was never intended to mean neutrality. It was always supposed to mean an objective method. Remember, this is the 1920s. After Freud, after modernism, we are acutely aware of the fact that humans have biases, newly aware of it, in fact. And intellectuals say, well, let's make journalism more objective, not because it's possible to be neutral, precisely so that there could be a method to overcome our subjectivity. So this is where we are now in the 21st century, is a return to objectivity of method, not neutrality. The scientific spirit that Walter Lippmann talked about, that the method must be objective precisely because the person cannot be. So I did have a slide about show me and trust me. So the discipline of verification, the how of how we go about our work, matters even more. Proof of method, of process. This is the essential antidote to fake news. Why? Because fake news has no method. If you make it up, you just make it up. Explaining the why, not just the how we did this story, but why did we choose to do this story in the first place? Why is this news? This is something that journalists often take for granted. We think, well, we're uncovering the truth, we're monitoring power, we're a watchdog. People understand this. They understand our role. No, they often don't. They think our motives are suspect, not just our methods. So we need to explain our motives much more than we think we do. Transparency, by the way, can also encourage news fluency. If we make our work more transparent, people will become more discerning consumers the more they consume. What we call in the United States news literacy, I think it's a terrible phrase. I like the word news fluency, because if you're literate, you can either read or not read. It's very binary. We think of fluency as something you can master and get better at. So there are several initiatives going on in the United States right now that build on this concept of transparency. The Coral Project, Hearken, which is a method for listening to your readers, Trusting News, which is works with news organizations to show them how to do transparency. The Trust Project, which is funded by Google, Ground Source, and others. It's also important to understand that what people mean by truth as consumers varies by topic. National politics is where we see the greatest level of media fragmentation in the United States. There's an old concept that local is a way of fighting polarization. If you want to fight polarization, talk to mayors, because they have to solve very similar problems: snow removal and potholes. Sports, weather, public safety, these are areas where our media consumption is not very fragmented. The other two core principles that relate to telling the truth are under special challenge. I won't go through all of them, but I think it's very important to recognize that loyalty to citizens above all, which is the second element of journalism, means that this one is challenged by fragmentation. When a news organization like MSNBC or Fox in the United States that's very partisan decides it's going to appeal to an audience based on appealing to that audience's political preferences, that erodes the notion that journalists are really loyal to citizens rather than party. The second is, and this loyalty to audience needs to be renewed. It's audience first is a new concept. In the United States, the future economic model of journalism is going to be based on subscriptions, winning people over, understanding what makes them loyal, and understanding your data. This whole push towards data is a new kind of audience. In fact, the concept that people talk about in the United States today is not digital first, but audience first, precisely because the technology is constantly shifting. But if you stay close to your audience, you'll shift with them. And journalists must be independent from those they cover. We have a very popular talk show host at night who also advises President Trump on how to tweet. This kind of thing, he's very popular. This kind of thing is really damaging. By the way, in the United States, we also have cable channels. All three cable channels today are essentially building their audience by appealing to partisanship. This is a form of the press destroying itself from within. So independence is under siege from various pressures of this sort. As I said, we're playing right into it when we decide that we can make money by appealing to partisanship. So it's also popular in the United States. Jay Rosen, who's a friend of mine, talks about the view from nowhere, that journalists have a view from nowhere and that this is undermining what they do. That is wrong. Journalists have always had a view from somewhere. Where is that view from? Well, it's from facts. It's from empiricism. It's from understanding the needs of your community and the needs of your audience and speaking the language of your audience, not in a partisan way, but in a way that is very empirical. If we lose our independence, if we become partisans, then we lose our claim to be truth tellers who verify, we become merely another political actor, another platform. We become simply media with no higher claim or higher purpose. This is precisely what despots want. This is precisely what Trump wants. When he says we're the enemy of the people and we act like it, we act like we're his enemy, we play into his hands. Before I go, 4 other ideas that I want to throw in that are part of how we build our renewal. The first one is that we must remain calm and professional. No one wants their doctor or their police officer to lose their cool. When you go into the hospital, in the emergency room, with a terrible problem, you don't want the doctor to say, "Oh my God, you've got a terrible problem. I don't know what I'm going to do about this." No, you want that person to be steeped in their professionalism, and we need that from the press. Hysteria plays into the enemy briar patch, into the rhetoric of despots. Marty Baron says, we're at work, not at war. What's the difference between war versus work? It is that when you're at war, you take sides. You use stronger language. You say the president is a liar. You lose your dispassion and your neutrality. Let's call it as I see it. Well, doing that is exactly what Trump wants. When we're at work, it means that we adhere to these core principles, but execute them differently in the way I've been talking about. Some things change, and some are fundamental. The second big idea that I want to give you is that news is a collaborative intelligence. Technology and audience are our partners, not our rivals. What I mean by news is collaborative intelligence is that machines can count. Artificial intelligence can do things that we used to have to do by hand. They can predict. They can make our news more empirical. Audiences, at the same time, have multiple expertise, multiple perspectives. If I want to do a story about heart disease, there are many doctors in the audience who I can ask their expertise of. Journalists have a special role here too. We can triangulate all that other information. We can listen. We have access to interrogators, and we can translate what we've learned better than the average person can. So this is a triangle of assets. Your consumers are your community. They're also your ambassadors. They're the best way to build your audience. They're not a threat. The audience is not going to, citizen journalism is not a threat to journalism, it's an asset. The third big idea is that we need to build our news differently. Anticipate audiences' questions, then answer them ahead of time. Imagine with each story that you do, what are the questions that the audience is going to have about them? And can I not only answer them, but not hide my answer inside my story, but maybe I can build answers to these questions on the outside of the story as a way to attract people in. So imagine you have a big story and you've got, you billboard it with, why did we do this story? What's new here? Who are our sources? What should you do about this? All of these are summaries, and then they pull me into the story. It's just a way of imagining that news is more than simply the narrative that you've done, the core story. That's a part of it, but you've built many things around it. Build differently is another way, by the way, of creating the news fluency that I talked about. Visual storytelling. I spent 16 years as one of the co-founders of the Pew Research Center. We would do 90-page surveys, and people would see one graphic and get the core of the results. Visual storytelling can be revelatory. The last idea is label better. This is an old idea that we have given up on in many ways, and we need to come back to. What is news? What is analysis? What is opinion? We did a survey at the American Press Institute long ago, and we found that the majority of Americans do not know the difference between an editorial and a news story. They don't even know the term op-ed, which is an old print concept, the columns that are opposite the editorials, op-ed. If you grew up in a non-print world, you're talking some foreign language here. We take this foreign language for granted, and we shouldn't. By the way, let me just, on the question of labeling, online, particularly on your phone, the notion that this is in the such and such section, or this is a big story because it has a big headline on page 1, none of that exists. Every headline is the same size, and there are no sections, and there is no above the fold. And this is the primary device by which the majority of people in the world are now getting their news and information. So design our news for the devices on which it's. In short, truth endures. It really is the enduring principle, and democracy depends on it. But we are no longer gatekeepers. We have to understand how our role has changed. We need to serve truth differently, often as annotators. We need to recognize we're in the show-me era of news. We need to understand that it's our method that's objective, not us. We need to be transparent about why we do things. We need to remain calm and professional. Embrace the collaborative intelligence that journalism now has. Build our journalism differently so people can see inside it. And for goodness sakes, label. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions?
Yes. 언론이 존재해야 하는 이유나 저널리즘의 역할을 다시 한번 일깨워 주신 좋은 강연이었습니다. 자, 이어서 질의응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠는데요. 저희가 어플리케이션을 통해서 접수받은 질문들 중에 한두 개 정도를 선별해서 진행을 하겠는데, 로젠스틸 원장님께서 답변을 해주시는 동안에도 강연에 대해서 질문을 계속해서 등록해 주셔도 됩니다. 그러면은 저희가 첫 질문 이후에도 질문 선별에 반영을 해서 진행을 하도록 하겠으니까 강연이 끝난 후에도 계속해서 질문들을 등록해 주시기 바랍니다. 그러면 첫 번째 질문. 시민들이 이미 다른 질문이군요. 저널리즘의 신뢰 위기는 저널리즘이 누렸던 권위의 위기에서 비롯된다고 봅니다. 그리고 오늘날 미디어 기술의 발전은 정보의 민주주의를 강화시키고 있으며 저널리즘의 권위는 하락할 수밖에 없습니다. 사람들은 저널리즘을 거치지 않고도 검색 엔진이나 소셜미디어를 통해 저널리즘이 전달하지 않는 사실이나 진실에 접근할 수 있기 때문이죠. 물론 일부 가짜 뉴스 문제도 있지만 디지털 기술 발전에 따른 정보 민주주의 확대는 긍정적인 것이고 저널리즘 권위 하락이나 신뢰 하락은 이 과정에서 불가피하다고 봅니다. 이에 대한 의견은 무엇입니까?
So when you have as much information as we do now, people are, I think the demand is not who has it first or who has it most in depth, but people are looking for what of all the things I'm hearing should I believe? And they need evidence so that they can see why they should believe it. We were in an environment in the newspaper era, and then in the each technology brings its own specializations. Newspapers were very good at providing facts, and when we didn't have other electronic technology, we would do multiple editions a day. Radio came along, and we could hear the news for the first time and hear the voice of leaders. Television came along, and we could see all of a sudden the news happen. And then satellite and technology came along, and we could see it live. The internet has brought many, many voices, but most of those voices are offering opinions. They're not reporting. So in many ways, our media culture has, the opinion component of our media culture has exploded in size. The repertorial and verification component of our media culture has shrunk. We need to make the most of that as journalists and not fall into spreading more opinion and offering simply analysis. There's plenty of analysis to go around. So report, 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 verify, verify, verify.
네, 다음 질문으로 넘어가도록 하겠습니다. 최근 온라인의 유사 미디어, 기존 미디어의 채널들이 보급되면서 사실 혹은 진실에 대한 갑론을박이 이어지고 있습니다. 특히 한국에서는 정치적 영역에 관해 이런 현상이 좀 심화하고 있다는 생각이 드는데요. 한국의 미디어 현상에 대해서는 어떤 진단이 가능할까요?
Well, I'm not going to be able to say much about the Korean media. I have a hard enough time understanding the American media. One of the issues, of course, is that politicians, particularly at the national level, they want to nationalize all rhetoric. They want to make every issue, regardless of where it is, about them and about national issues. The reality is that most of our lives are affected by local things. How long what the roads are like, and how long it takes to get to work, and do I have a job, and actually national political actors have a limited impact on those things. So it's important for local media to survive. The other thing that we're seeing, at least in the United States, is in the last 6 or 7 years, social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter and to some extent Instagram, became the primary way by which people were getting news, particularly people under 40. They were getting, and the traffic to most news organizations online was coming more heavily from Facebook than any other source. That has actually begun to change for a variety of reasons, one of which is Facebook has devalued news in its app, in its algorithm. The other is there's some evidence that people are exhausted by this national polarization, and they are dropping out of, they're actually accessing news less frequently when they see it in their stream. And they're dropping off of platforms that are oriented towards national news. Instagram, particularly among millennials, is more popular now than Facebook. Facebook is trying to experiment with putting local news into people's streams, which is something that they have not done in the past because people don't click on it. But this notion that local is a way of creating common ground is something that Facebook and Google are thinking about. Ultimately, some of this is going to require journalists arguing with the platforms. I will tell you that I know the people at Google and Facebook. I work with them a lot. They do not understand the implications of their own platforms. I was at a meeting with them the other day in which they said they believe that meaningful interaction is when people share and like something. And I said, no one shares something or likes it if it's new and they think, I don't know what I think about this. I need to read more about this. No one shares that, and no one likes that. The social media is in some ways bipolar. It's either hysterical or euphoric. So I said to the people at Facebook, in news, what we consider meaningful interaction is someone reads it and starts to think about it in a new way. Not that they go, yeah, yeah, yeah. So what we think of meaningful interaction in news is quite different than what the social platforms do, because they're trying to monetize the outrage or the happiness. They said, we have to think about that. They're not going to think about it very long, but we're just in a very different place, and we need to continue to make our case with them. Just one other point about the platforms. In some ways, we have a new economy that's been built by Facebook in particular, that identifies what makes us different from each other. That's how we target ads. I understand that you have this hobby and you have this hobby and you have these interests, so the ads you see are going to be different. That's fine. That's an ad economy based on targeting. But political actors have exploited that technology about what separates us for their own political needs, and the platforms did not anticipate the implications of that. And they still do not understand the implications of that.
네, 다음 질문으로 넘어가도록 해보겠습니다. 교수님은 저서 디지털 저널리즘 시대의 윤리에서도 투명성, transparency를 중요 가치로 언급하셨습니다. 하지만 취재원 보호를 비롯한 조건 속에서 기자가 얼마나 투명해져야 할지 궁금합니다. 저널리스트들이 현실적으로 적용할 수 있는 투명성의 한계는 어디까지라고 생각하시는지요?
It's a good question. In the end, trust in media is not actually just about how we did things. The bottom line of trust is whether people trust our motives. So if we share information whenever we can, people will trust us more when we tell them, I cannot share this with you. The research is very clear. People don't mind the use of anonymous sources completely. In fact, in a study we just did, the majority of Americans said they understand and approve of the use of anonymous sources, but they think it's widely overused. So if we share when we can, we'll have the ability to withhold. We will have that capacity to say, you just need to trust me this time because I shared everything with you all the other times.
네, 다음 질문으로 넘어가도록 하겠습니다. 정치계에서 가짜 뉴스에 대한 법적 규제 의견이 나오는데 어떻게 생각하시는지요?
Well, so it's different in different countries. In the United States, we have the First Amendment, and and we don't want our president to start touching our First Amendment, so or making certain things illegal. However, it is certainly viable for the platforms to begin to block things that they know are fake. And a year and a half ago, after the election, they said they had no capacity to do that. They are slowly coming around to recognize. We have someone from Google here. I was in a meeting where Google talked about during breaking news, when things are moving very quickly, they're actually, and I may get this wrong, they're going to elevate trusted news sources in the stream because they know that when something's breaking, fake news can move very quickly, whereas the journalists who have to verify things are almost always at a disadvantage. The old line that a lie can go around the world in an instant while the truth is still putting its pants on. So Google has recognized that during breaking news instances, there's a difference and they need to tweak the algorithm. I hope they keep it tweaked after the breaking news is slowed down.